The Man Who Chose Long Beach, California, September 1969, a Sunday, just past 1 p.m. The Long Beach Arena smelled the way large public spaces smell when they've been full of people since early morning. The composite odor of 1,000 different lives temporarily occupying the same air. Concession food, floor cleaner. The particular sweat of men who train seriously, which is different from ordinary sweat. Denser, with a mineral quality. The byproduct of bodies pushed past the comfortable threshold into the range where real adaptation happens. The overhead lights were bright and indiscriminate, flattening everything they touched. The scoreboard at the far end of the arena had been repurposed with handwritten brackets and black marker. Somewhere above the main floor, a public address system crackled with intermittent announcements in a voice that suggested the microphone was not quite cooperating. The Long Beach International Karate Championships, 1969. The second year it had been held in this configuration, open format, contact allowed within rules that were still being worked out, a convergence of styles and schools and traditions that was either the future of American martial arts or an argument that hadn't resolved itself yet. Men had come from Texas and New York and Georgia and Illinois and a few from Japan and Korea, some with long competitive records and some with nothing but 2 or 3 years of intensive training and the specific audacity of youth. The bleachers held perhaps 3,000 spectators, though the number shifted constantly as people moved between the various competition rings set up on the arena floor. Chuck Norris was the defending champion of his division. He had won the previous year and had spent the intervening 12 months doing what he always did after winning something, training harder than he had before it, as though the title were a liability rather than an asset, a standard he now owed the world rather than a proof he'd achieved. He was 29 years old. He was at something close to the peak of the physical form that would sustain his championship for another 5 years, a form built through hundreds of thousands of repetitions, and a dietary discipline and a sleep consistency that his training partners sometimes found oppressive in its regularity. He stood in one of the preparation areas near the north wall with Bob Wall, who was his friend and sometimes his sparring partner, and who had that particular gift of being genuinely happy at someone else's success without it costing him anything. Wall was talking about something. Norris was listening with the portion of his attention that was available, which was perhaps 40%. The remaining 60% was elsewhere, in the zone that experienced competitors learn to occupy before a match, a state that isn't quite relaxation and isn't quite tension, but exists between them like the surface of still water. The man who chose him had arrived from Phoenix that morning. His name was Terry Donovan, and he was 24 years old, and he was, by any honest assessment, very good. Not Norris good, but that qualifier excluded nearly everyone in the building. And within the range of American karate in 1969, Donovan occupied a legitimate place. He'd trained in Okinawan Goju-Ryu for 6 years under an instructor named Frank Sheridan in Phoenix, a former Marine who'd brought the style back from his service in the Pacific and taught it with the unsentimental rigor of someone who'd understood it as a survival system before he understood it as an art. Donovan was 5'11", lean, quick in his initial movement, and possessed of a right reverse punch that the people at his school had stopped trying to counter because the speed-to-power ratio was genuinely unusual. He'd won his first 3 bouts of the day in respectable fashion. Not dominant fashion. The third fight had gone to points, close enough that the decision could have gone the other way without causing protest. But he was upright and healthy, and his joints felt good, and the particular clarity that sometimes descends on athletes in the middle of competition, that state where the body's decisions precede the mind's awareness of them, had been with him since the second round of the morning. In the preparation area, he was consulting the bracket. A volunteer, a teenager with a clipboard and the earnest bewilderment of someone who'd expected this job to be simpler, was explaining the next round's matchups. Donovan ran his finger down the bracket until he found the next name his might meet, and he saw options. And one of the options was Chuck Norris. The teenager with the clipboard said that he could potentially avoid the Norris bracket for another round if the draw fell a certain way. Donovan shook his head. "No," he said. "Give me Norris." This requires understanding because it was not stupidity. Terry Donovan had a plan. He'd been thinking about it since he drove into the parking lot at 6 that morning. The plan was based on something his instructor Sheridan had said. Not about Norris specifically, but about champions in general, about the way repetitive success creates its own vulnerability. The theory, which had some merit, if not quite the merit Donovan assigned it, was that champions develop expectations. They get used to opponents who react to them in certain ways, who are thrown by certain sequences, who hesitate at particular moments. The theory suggested that a truly aggressive, unpredictable opening, something that disrupted the established rhythm of a champion's experience, could crack open a window in the first 30 seconds, before the muscle memory fully engaged. He was not wrong about the theory. He was wrong about the variable. He had underestimated the depth to which Chuck Norris's muscle memory ran, and the extent to which unpredictable as a tactical approach, has diminishing returns against someone who has internalized a range of responses that exceed the attacker's range of actions. They met in Ring 3 at 1:18 p.m. The ring had a moderate audience, perhaps 200 people standing in a rough oval at a respectful distance, with a knot of perhaps 30 closer in, the people who followed Norris specifically, who had come to the tournament the way people attend performances of musicians they admire, knowing the general shape of the experience, but curious about the specific texture of today's interpretation. Bob Wall was not in the crowd. He was competing himself in an adjacent ring and would only hear about this afterward. What he heard, from 3 different people who described it 3 different ways, all of them converging on the same essential fact. It was over before it seemed possible. Donovan came out exactly as he'd planned. Aggressive, angular, attacking, before the first formal exchange could establish a tempo. He threw the right reverse punch at an unusual moment, fractionally early in the sequence, a timing disruption that had worked against his earlier opponents. It was a good punch, technically sound, effectively timed, carrying the power that Sheridan's marine-inflected training had built into it over 6 years. Norris wasn't there. Not in the supernatural sense that the Chuck Norris mythology would later elaborate, simply in the functional sense that his body had processed the incoming information and produced a response before Donovan's conscious mind had registered the sequence as complete. Norris had not thought his way to the response. Thinking takes too long. He had simply been present in the way that 2 years of Korean training and 7 years of subsequent refinement had taught him to be present, and the response had arrived the way water arrives at the low point of a landscape, not chosen, but inevitable. The exchange lasted less than 8 seconds. At the end of it, Terry Donovan was on the boundary line of the ring, having been taken there by a combination of Norris's footwork and 2 controlled strikes that had landed with the precision of things planned weeks in advance. He had not been injured. He was breathing. His body was present. But something had happened in those 8 seconds that was difficult to describe in the language of technique, because technique doesn't fully capture it. What had happened was closer to a reckoning, the specific experience of discovering that the map you arrived with does not describe the territory you've entered. The judge called the point. Donovan stood at the line for a moment. His hands were up. His stance was correct. He was doing everything right except for the thing that could not be manufactured, which was the certainty that any of it would matter. In the break before the second round, he stood at his corner and his training partner, a heavy-set man from Phoenix named Garza, who had driven to Long Beach with him and was now watching with the expression of someone trying to be helpful in a situation that has moved beyond the help he came equipped to give, said, "What happened?" Donovan shook his head. He wasn't sure he could explain it. He was still inside the experience, still processing the sensation of executing something correctly and having it be, in some profound sense, irrelevant. "I threw the punch," he said. "I know," Garza said. And then he stopped. The "and then" was the part that didn't translate into the vocabulary of technique. When the second round was called, Terry Donovan took his position in the ring. He stood in his stance, which was correct and honest, and the product of 6 years of genuine training. He looked across the ring at Chuck Norris, who was looking back at him with an expression that was, and this is the detail that Donovan would remember specifically, would think about years later when he was an instructor himself, and was trying to explain to students the difference between competition and something larger. Not the expression of a man sizing up an opponent. It was the expression of a man who was paying attention. Simply that. Complete, uncomplicated attention to the person in front of him, without prejudgment or contempt, or the comfortable assumption of outcome. It was the kind of attention that is, paradoxically, both humbling and clarifying, because it treats you as real, as someone whose presence and capacity deserve to be genuinely met, rather than administratively processed. Donovan lowered his hands. He stepped back out of his fighting stance. He bowed. It was a clean, formal bow, the kind that in his tradition signals the end of a round, acknowledgement of an opponent, the recognition of something. The judge was confused. Garza was confused. The crowd of 200 was briefly, collectively uncertain about what they were watching. Norris bowed back. The judge, after a moment, signaled the match to continue. Donovan raised his hands again and they fought the second round, which was controlled and honest and produced no further surprises. Norris won the match. He went on to win the tournament. This was expected. What was not in the record was the conversation that happened near the water table at the side of the arena approximately 40 minutes after the match, when the division was finished and the crowd had thinned around Ring 3 and Donovan, still in his GI, went looking for something to drink and found Norris there, refilling a cup from a plastic jug. Donovan said, "The timing on that first exchange..." He paused. "I have never had someone read that sequence." Norris handed him a cup of water. He thought about the answer for a moment, not performing the thinking, but actually thinking. 6 years, he said. "You've got 6 good years in your body." What Sheridan teaches is real. He paused. The punch is there. You need more angles. That was all. Norris filled his own cup and drank, and someone across the arena called his name, and he raised a hand in acknowledgement and walked away. Donovan held the cup of water and stood next to the plastic jug for a moment. He thought about the bow, about what it had been inside him in the moment of doing it. He'd been a competitor long enough to know that bowing out of a match, you can still technically fight, is not a thing that happens often, and that it can be read as weakness by people who have decided that the point of fighting is to be seen persisting. He had not experienced it as weakness. He had experienced it as clarity. The bow was the moment he admitted to himself what his body already knew. Not that he would lose, which was probable, but that he was in the presence of something he did not yet understand, and that continuing without acknowledging that fact would be a form of dishonesty. He went back to Phoenix and changed his training. He added angles. He worked on timing from positions his body didn't yet know. He thought about the 8 seconds, not with resentment or injury, but with the same quality of attention that he'd seen in Norris's eyes before the second round. Complete, uncomplicated, clear. He became a good instructor. He told his students about Long Beach once, in a class where a student had asked him what the difference was between a good fighter and a great one. Time, he said. The great one just has more time inside each second. His student thought he was talking about experience. He was. But he was also talking about something else, like about the 8 seconds in Ring 3, about the way a thing can be executed correctly and still be met with a response that it cannot contain, about the bow that ended nothing and changed everything. The Long Beach arena was loud that afternoon. Somewhere in an adjacent ring, another match was being decided. The overhead lights flattened everything equally. The crowd, the brackets, the fighters, the water table, the plastic jugs that held water that tasted faintly of the container it came in. The Santa Ana winds pressed against the building's exterior. 2 men stood near the water, and one of them said something real, and then one of them walked away. Long Beach International Karate Championships, September 1969.